Emily Dawson had never truly understood how quiet a house could be until the day Jacob, her husband of 10 years, was gone for good. After his sudden heart attack last winter, the lake house they'd once filled with laughter, weekend jazz records, and slow dancing in the kitchen turned cold in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of him in every little thing. His toothbrush still sat in the holder. His coat still hung by the door. But he was gone, and the grief lived in her bones. Most days, she moved like a ghost through the house they'd built together, clinging to routines she no longer had reason to follow. The only person who ever showed up anymore was Nate Harris, Jacob's best friend since high school. A quiet man with a dependable presence. He started coming by once a week to help out fixing the loose deck boards, taking care of the snow in the driveway, even helping feed the dogs when she couldn't bring herself to do it. Emily wasn't sure why he kept coming. Maybe out of loyalty, maybe out of guilt, or maybe because, like her, he didn't quite know where else to go now that Jacob was gone. But one rainy evening in late March, something between them quietly shifted. They were sitting on the porch, wrapped in thick blankets, sipping coffee as the storm rolled across the lake. It had become their habit, silent company in the early evenings, when the weight of the day felt heaviest. She looked at him as he spoke softly about a memory of Jacob, how the two of them used to skip class and sneak out to the lake when they were 17. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. And that's when it happened. Not a dramatic moment. No touching, no words. Just the way Nate looked at her gently, with a softness in his eyes that held more than friendship. She noticed, and it startled her. It warmed her too. Because, if she was honest, she hadn't felt seen in a long time. Not since Jacob, not since her body became a shell carrying grief. She looked away quickly, unsure if she had imagined it. But the moment stayed with her through the night. As she lay in bed alone, curled up on Jacob's side out of habit, she thought about Nate's hands, rough from years of carpentry, and how careful he always was when he moved around her. She thought about how he brought her favorite tea without asking, how he always remembered to turn on the porch light before he left, and then she wondered, was she lonely, or was something else happening? She hadn't thought about another man since Jacob. She hadn't let herself. But here was Nate, showing up when the world had fallen apart, offering more than just help. Offering something quieter, deeper, something like comfort. Something like ... hope. That night, she realized that maybe what her heart craved wasn't just healing. It was connection. And for the first time since Jacob's passing, she didn't cry herself to sleep. Instead, she lay awake, wondering what Nate was thinking and if he, too, had felt that strange, unspoken pull between them. A feeling that left her both scared and alive. Nate Harris had always been the kind of man who kept things buried deep. He didn't wear his feelings on his sleeve, and maybe that's why Emily never noticed the way he looked at her. Even years ago, when she first married Jacob, he had loved her quietly, from a distance, never letting it show. Back then, she belonged to his best friend Jacob, the golden boy. The one who made everyone laugh and filled every room with light. Nate had stepped aside without ever speaking a word of what he felt. But now, Jacob was gone, and Nate was still here, showing up week after week, fixing broken things in her house, and holding space for her grief like no one else could. One afternoon in April, the sun had finally warmed the chill off the lake. And Emily asked Nate to help her fix the cabinet door in the kitchen that kept coming off its hinges. It was a small thing, but she needed the company more than the repair. As he worked, she stood beside him, handing him tools, their arms brushing now and then. But when his hand reached for the screwdriver and touched hers, something shifted. It was such a small moment, just skin against skin, but it stopped them both. Emily looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw it in his eyes. The ache, the want, the years of holding back. And in that second, something fluttered inside her. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't betrayal. It was hunger, not just for touch, but to feel something again, something warm and alive. Nate pulled his hand back quickly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, like he was afraid of himself. She shook her head, but the words didn't come. That evening, Nate didn't stay for coffee. He left early, quiet and stiff, like he was running from something. Emily watched him walk away, her heart pounding harder than it had in months. She spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what had passed between them. She remembered how Jacob used to kiss her shoulders in the morning, how he'd touch her back in the kitchen just to let her know he was there. She missed that. She missed being wanted, being held. She missed the warmth of being seen, not as a widow, not as someone broken, but as a woman. And when she thought about Nate, about his rough hands, his steady eyes, his silence full of meaning, didn't feel ashamed. She felt alive. But the next day came, and the next, and still he didn't show. The space he left behind was heavier than she expected. It wasn't just the absence of his help, it was the absence of him. His quiet presence had become part of her healing, and now she realized that she didn't just want Nate there. She needed him. Not because he was Jacob's friend, not because he fixed things, but because in a world where everything had fallen apart, he was the only one who made her feel whole again. And deep down, Emily wondered if maybe Nate needed her too. Not as a reminder of Jacob, but as the woman he'd never had the courage to reach for. Until now. A week passed, and Emily felt every single day, without Nate, like an ache she couldn't explain. She told herself it was fine, that she was just used to having someone around. Someone to help, but deep down, she knew it was more. It wasn't about the repairs or the groceries. It was about the way he looked at her that night in the kitchen, like he saw past the widow, past the sadness, straight into the woman she still was underneath it all. That kind of gaze doesn't just disappear. She tried to distract herself with books, long walks by the lake, and late-night calls from her sister, who kept saying she'd eventually move on. But the truth was, a part of her already had. And that part kept waiting for Nate to come back. Then, one soft evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting gold through the windows, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find him standing there, holding a small box of her favorite lavender chamomile tea. His eyes looked tired, like he hadn't slept much, and before she could say a word, he spoke. "I didn't mean to stay away so long," he said quietly. "I just didn't want to make things worse." She stepped aside, and he walked in like he had so many times before, but this time, the air between them felt different, thicker, heavier, charged with all the things they hadn't said. They sat on the couch a few inches apart, hands close, but not touching. She asked him if he was okay, and his reply came slowly, like he was weighing every word. "I've missed him too, he said. "More than I know how to say. But I've also missed you, not just since he passed. For longer than I should admit." Emily's heart skipped. She turned to look at him, and his eyes were full of something that had always been there but now refused to hide: longing, guilt, hope. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand on his. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, "but I don't feel wrong about it." He nodded, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a slow, unsure motion. That small touch nearly undid her. They didn't kiss. They didn't rush. Instead, they stayed in that quiet space between grief and something new, holding on to each other with hands that knew loss, but still remembered how to give comfort. She made them both tea, and they sat near the window as night fell, sharing memories of Jacob, funny stories, old habits, the way he used to hum when he cooked. They laughed, then cried. And when she leaned her head against Nate's shoulder, he didn't move. He just sat there, warm and steady, like the part of her life that hadn't fallen apart. As the clock ticked past midnight and the world outside fell silent, Emily realized she wasn't just healing, she was feeling again. And with Nate beside her, the loneliness didn't win. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to hope. And though they hadn't said what this new closeness meant, deep down they both knew something had shifted forever. As the months moved on, something soft and real began to grow between Emily and Nate, not rushed, not loud, but steady, like a river carving its way through stone. They never sat down to define it, never spoke the word love, but it was there in every shared glance, every quiet dinner. Every time he reached for her hand without thinking. They weren't trying to replace what was lost. They were simply finding new ways to feel alive again. Nate became more than just a familiar face, he became her calm, her safety, the one person who understood what she carried. Some nights, he stayed late, reading beside her on the porch swing while the dogs slept at their feet. Other times, he cooked for her, nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup. But it felt like a feast because it was made with care. And slowly, her laughter came back. Her light came back. She'd catch herself watching him when he wasn't looking, how he smiled at the dogs, how his hands moved with quiet strength, how his eyes still held something tender every time they landed on her. One evening, under a sky brushed with soft orange and lavender, they sat on the dock, their feet dangling over the water, the lake still and glowing in the fading light. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, and after a long pause, she asked the question that had been sitting on her chest for weeks. "Do you think this is wrong?" "Us." Her voice was barely a whisper. Nate was quiet for a moment, then turned to her with that calm gaze she'd come to trust. "No," he said gently. "I think Jacob would have wanted you to be happy. He loved you too much to want you stuck in sadness forever." She didn't answer right away, but tears filled her eyes, not because she was unsure, but because some part of her needed permission to let go of guilt. Nate kissed her hand, slow and warm, and she felt her heart break open a little more, but in a good way. In a way that meant healing was finally starting. It wasn't about forgetting Jacob. It was about choosing to keep living. Their bond wasn't built on tragedy, was built on kindness, on shared memories, on the way they both knew what it meant to lose someone and still choose to stay soft. They started spending weekends together, hiking through the woods, cooking, watching old movies Jacob used to love. Sometimes, they'd talk about the past. Other times, they just enjoyed the quiet of the present. And even when doubt tried to creep in, Emily would look at Nate and remember how he had stayed not out of duty, but out of love. A different kind of love, one that had waited quietly for years, respectful, patient, and now, finally, free to breathe. One night in early fall, she stood in the kitchen, wrapped in one of Nate's flannel shirts, looking out at the trees turning amber and red. He came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. She didn't need to say anything, neither did he. In that simple silence, There was everything: trust, affection, desire, peace. Emily knew then that she hadn't moved on. She had simply moved forward. And sometimes, that's where the most beautiful kind of love waits, not in the past, but just beyond the grief. In the arms of someone who understands how deeply you've loved, and still chooses to love you anyway.